In this lesson, we're going to continue with the motives for the exploration of the New World by the Spanish, French, and English. Once again, we started to talk about the motives of the Spanish and the French yesterday. First, we reviewed a vocabulary term of conquistador, which were Spanish conquerors of the New World. And some of the Spanish motives were to look for gold, but also they started to set up encomiendas, or large plantations. Here is the attire of a conquistador, or a Spanish conqueror, right here. The hat is the most familiar of these things and one of the defining characteristics of the conquistador. Here are some Native Americans, probably the Maya, that were taken over and conquered by these conquistadors in the Spanish quest for gold. We, of course, went over the motives of the Spanish, which was to look for gold, and also their contributions to the New World, as they called it, which included the building of cities, universities, missions, which were for spreading the Catholic religion, and they also transferred their social class system and would set up encomiendas, as was already mentioned. The Spanish colonization of the New World was mainly Central and South America, but also included parts of Florida and California along the Pacific coast. We also talked about how the Spanish initially enslaved the natives, but the natives had no immunity against the deadly disease, smallpox, that the Spanish brought. So soon the disease combined with, or sometimes separately, the overwork that was demanded by the Spanish conquerors decimated the Native American population. And after this decimation, African slaves began to be used. We began to look at the French colonization and motives for the French exploration and colonization of the Americas. And these motives include the development of a prosperous fur trade with Native Americans, as well as the search for the Northwest Passage. The French colonization of the Americas stretched from the St. Lawrence River, and it was mainly in parts of Canada, but it also included Louisiana, because their search for the Northwest Passage led them to sail up the Mississippi River, which they actually figured out was not the Northwest Passage. And in that search, they claimed Louisiana for their king. Now, Louisiana was much bigger than what we have here. The Louisiana Territory was enormous because they claimed most of the land that was along the Mississippi River, and the Louisiana Territory would be as big as I just shaded in blue here. Now, later on, the new United States, once we declared our independence, would buy this Louisiana Territory from the French, from Napoleon, in what was known as the Louisiana Purchase. Today we're going to look at the English motives for the exploration and colonization of the New World. which were very similar to the Spanish in that they were looking for gold, but they were unsuccessful and had to find other ways to make money and make a profit. Before we get to the English, though, let's look at the PowerPoint and go over a few points that were missed yesterday. And one of those were I mentioned the establishment of Montreal and Quebec, where the French established trading posts, but few settled due to the cold climate. But the consequence of the few settling also brought the French into much friendlier relations with the Native Americans, because the Native Americans never saw the French as a threat to their land. Also talked about were restrictions the French had on the religions that would emigrate. French Protestants, those who were protesting against the Catholic Church, you probably know the name of the leader of the Protestant Reformation, or at least have heard of him. Martin Luther started the Protestant religion, but it spread throughout Europe, and some countries such as France, whose king was Catholic and the state religion was Catholic, did not want French Protestants to infiltrate and taint in some respects the New World. The French also, they traveled down the Mississippi River and claimed Louisiana, which, here's the state of Louisiana. The French territory of Louisiana was much larger, which they named after their king. Now, go back to your notes, and England had different motives for settling and colonizing the New World. Now, initially, the English motive for colonization of the New World was to search for gold. In future lessons, we're going to learn about the first English settlement, which was at Jamestown, Virginia, where the search for gold doomed the early attempts at settling that area because they did not establish a strong enough settlement that could sustain itself. The English who initially came for gold realized that there was really no gold to be had in the areas in which they settled. But they soon learned that they could grow tobacco as the Spanish did and make a great profit, which became the #1 model for the English colonies, or the motive for taking new lands, which was to grow cash crops, which the earliest of those cash crops were tobacco. The English also, another motive for coming to the Americas, were some English Protestants, those who were breaking from the Church of England. They were fleeing religious persecution and seeking a new home where they could practice their Protestant religion without being beat up and other forms of discrimination is a good word for persecution, although persecution could also mean being put to death. Now, these groups that were fleeing religious persecution were well known, and you've definitely heard of them. They would be the Pilgrims and the Puritans. England, though, would colonize mostly the east coast of the United States, the original 13 colonies. The original English colonies were here, where I'm going to lightly shade in gray, about right here. The first English colony was Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607, which we're going to talk about. But after that followed those who were fleeing religious persecution, and those people were the Pilgrims and Puritans, which would land up here in Massachusetts and establish religious havens where they could practice their Protestant religion in Virginia and New England. Now, we're about to close on the English colonization, which we're going to revisit in great detail later when we analyze the colonization of three distinct groups of English colonies, which were the New England, the Middle, and the Southern. Before we get there, though, we are going to talk just a little bit more about the English colonies. Way down here to the side of South America, we're going to write a little bit about the English colonies. And the English colonies, England, of course, did not colonize South America, but this is the only place I can fit this on the map. The English motives were for colonizing the New World. At first was to search for gold. Then it was to grow cash crops, including tobacco. And some of the things that the English brought with them, ideas and practices, were, of course, they brought their culture, their language. The colonies mostly brought the new English Protestant religion, which would be those that was practiced by the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and the colonies in the Americas would develop a very specific idea about self-government. And this idea about self-government would be one of the determining factors that causes England, or the English colonies, to eventually declare independence and declare themselves the United States of America. From the PowerPoint, once again, England, they sailed along the coast of North America and claimed that area for their king, starting with Virginia and the first colony, which was right about here, which was Jamestown, Virginia. The next would be where the Pilgrims and Puritans settled up in Massachusetts, the subject of the next lesson. Those that came first had the hope of discovering gold, but of course stayed to grow tobacco. And those that followed, the Pilgrims and Puritans, were fleeing religious persecution. In all, though, the English brought their language, their religion, and their ideas about self-government with them to the New World. Today, you can identify the main colonizers of the New World by the areas which speak the language which they brought here. Of course, the primary language in the U.S. is English. However, in many South American countries, it's Spanish. Now, the English also claim parts of Canada, so parts of Canada are English, while there are still areas, Quebec and Montreal, which are the dominant language is French. You can also see where there is a high frequency of Spanish speakers in the United States, even though it's become part of the United States, it was once Spanish colonies. Florida has Spanish as a high-frequency language spoken there because of the original Spanish colonizers. And you can also look at the names of places and figure out what country first settled there. Florida has many Spanish names and many cities that are named after Spanish names. California is the same way. The Spanish first settled California and claimed it, and you can see these Spanish names in Los Angeles. That is a very distinctly Spanish name, and San Francisco. For the next part of the lesson, we're going to look at the attempts of the French, English, and Spanish to settle South Carolina, which only one was ultimately successful, which would be the English. Just as in everywhere in the Americas, England, Spain, and France were competing for parts of these colonies. They also competed for the area that would be South Carolina. They vied for control or competed for control in South Carolina, and they tried to make their mother country richer by claiming these lands. However, it would prove to be a daunting task to claim and ultimately colonize South Carolina. So, once again, Spain, France, and England all competed for South Carolina. They vied for South Carolina or competed for it. The first attempt at even exploring South Carolina by a foreign nation was when a Spanish conqueror led an expedition into South Carolina, and this Spanish conqueror was Hernán de Soto. Hernán de Soto led a small group of men, numbering less than 100, through South Carolina looking for gold. Now, while Hernán de Soto was in South Carolina, they managed to not be very nice to the natives. In fact, they barely escaped with their lives because they captured a native princess and held her ransom, trying to get their people to tell where gold was. Of course, they could not, because South Carolina does not have any gold. But the natives in South Carolina's first experience with Europeans would be they're not very nice due to the activities of Hernán de Soto and his look for gold, or search for gold. Hernán de Soto's route, he came from Spanish Florida, Georgia, as we talked about, and he traveled all along South Carolina and eventually escaped down through Charleston, down here where Charleston is today. Now, the next attempt by one of these countries to colonize this land was by Spain, and this attempt is the earliest attempt at establishing a settlement in the United States, and this was in the 1520s in Georgetown, which is right down here. Now, this was a failed attempt on the part of the Spanish. The name of the failed settlement was San Miguel de Guadalupe. So the earliest attempt at settlement was San Miguel de Guadalupe, which was right down in Georgetown, which is very close to where we now live. Of course, Georgetown is probably the biggest city south of where we live. And this, it's amazing to think, 400 years ago is the place the Spanish tried to build the first settlement in what would become the Americas. Now, the next attempt at settling the Americas, or settling in South Carolina, happened down in Beaufort, South Carolina. In Beaufort, there was a group of French Protestants, which if you paid attention to the last lesson, you would say, I didn't think French Protestants were allowed to settle in the Americas. Well, it appears that they were allowed to settle in South Carolina. They just probably weren't allowed to settle in Quebec and Montreal. Well, the French Protestants, which I'm here drawing the interesting dress of the women that I looked up and found, they were called the Huguenots, and they settled in down here near Hilton Head. Now, these Huguenots were French Protestants once again. They followed Martin Luther's teaching, not the Catholic Church, which is why they were looked down upon in Europe. They founded a settlement called Charlesfort. And Charlesfort had some success, but eventually they had to abandon it. Now, the Spanish took advantage of the France's early attempt at settling and building Charlesfort, and they moved in to where the French had begun to build Charlesfort and tried to reestablish a colony called San Felipe. San Felipe lasted for a small amount of time in settlement years, 10 years, but then it was attacked by Native Americans, and the Spanish were run off, those who weren't killed. So, two settlements that were in the same place but at different times were Charlesfort and San Felipe. These two, first Charlesfort was established, and then Spain tried to establish San Felipe. So these three attempts were all failures. And the main reason that these were failures was because the mother countries pretty much said, go settle somewhere. And when these two groups, the Spanish and the French, settled, there was no supplies or support sent from the mother countries. So the Spanish and French settlement lacked supplies and support from their mother countries. Now, England would ultimately found the first successful colony in South Carolina. And this colony would be Charlestown. Charleston was founded in 1670, and it was started by English settlers who had come from another colony. The English had a colony down by Florida, a tiny island called Barbados. And Barbados was a small island, probably less than the size of Myrtle Beach, the city itself. And it was running out of room, and people there were looking for a place to settle. So they came to Charlestown, which was the early attempt of the English, and it became successful. Although it had to move because the original site was proven to be less than ideal. Now, the English that came to Charlestown were from Barbados, which is an island down by Florida. You will see it in a few lessons. So, because they came from another English colony, it was said that Charlestown was the colony of a colony. Now, the reason for the French and English failures were multiple, but they were all traced to this idea that they had lack of supplies and support from the mother countries. So once again, England was the only successful colonizer of the Carolinas. And the French and Spanish failed because of conditions at the settlement, problems in the mother countries, but most of all, the primary reason was the lack of supplies and support from the mother countries. I make an analogy to the colonies as the babies of the mother country. And the analogy I make is France and Spain had their baby, their colony, and let the baby loose to fend for itself. Now, we all know that babies need support. If they're not given support, the bottle, patted on the back once in a while, the baby is not going to survive. While the English, they had their baby, and their babies was named Charlestown. And they took care of their baby and gave it a burp once in a while. And as such, Charlestown survived as the only successful colony, while the French and English, who abandoned theirs, did not last. So, one of the main things that was important in this colonization was supplies and support from the mother country, and the French and Spanish the mother countries did not provide that supply and support, while the English did to their newborn Charlestown. And Charlestown in 1670 would become the first permanent colony in South Carolina that was started by the English. Although, as was said, they were actually from a little island, most of the settlers in Charlestown were from Barbados, which gave it the nickname of a colony of a colony. There are the French Huguenots, by the way, that we tried to draw. What colony did they develop? They tried to start Charlesfort. Here is a map of Charlestown from the air. Now, one of the reasons Charlestown was successful was because geographically, Charlestown offered protection, which was important from natives and also the Spanish and French attacks. Because just because the English tried to start a colony doesn't mean that the Spanish and French left them alone. No, often they were a threat just as the Native Americans were. So, just to go through the PowerPoint a little, France, England, and Spain were the main mother countries that were vying for control of South Carolina, and only one was successful. Which one? Hopefully you said, "You just taught me England." Yes, you're right. Only England was successful. Spain was the first to start an attempt at colonization, where Hernán de Soto traveled through South Carolina looking for gold. Here's Hernando de Soto right there. Later on, there was a guy named Ayollon, I believe is how you spell it, and he tried to lead the founding of a colony near Georgetown. That was the first attempt at colonizing at a colony in the Americas, or in the United States, what it is today. However, this was abandoned. It was a failure. It was a failure because of the lack of supplies and support from the mother country of Spain. Spain didn't take care of their baby, San Miguel, and San Miguel did not survive. The French Huguenots tried to found Charlestown in the 1560s near Beaufort, which is way down there by Hilton Head and Savannah, where the Yamasee live from the earlier lesson. However, they were unsuccessful because France did not provide them any supplies or supports. Spain then tried to build a settlement on that abandoned settlement of Charlesfort, which survived for 10 years, but then, probably due to the poor opinion the natives had of the Spanish anyway, due to Hernando de Soto's activities in the Carolinas, the natives attacked, and the survivors had to flee to the Spanish stronghold in the Americas, St. Augustine, Florida. This again was a failure, mainly because Spain, the mother country, abandoned her colony of San Felipe. England, though, would found the first permanent colony in South Carolina, Charlestown, which was populated mainly by English from another colony. What other colony? Yes, Barbados. And this would become the beginning of the settlement of South Carolina. More Barbadians would move there. They would also bring their slave system with them that they had developed in Barbados, And sadly, this would be the beginning of slavery in South Carolina, which would play a vital role in its economy until the slaves were emancipated after the Civil War. So the first settlers coming from Barbados brought that slave system with them, and the growing of cash crops through slave labor would become the basis for the South Carolina economy. This completes the lesson. Thank you for listening. I hope you did well.